Do you believe that Crossfire Hurricane was one of the most disgusting episodes in FBI history of a corrupt investigation led by corrupt people who wanted to take Donald Trump down?
Yes, sir.
You think that's why you're in this chair today, to fix that?
I think that's a big
Without Crossfire Hurricane, this guy wouldn't be here.
3 minutes earlier, Lindsey Graham asked a question that instantly changed the temperature of the room. And anyone who understands how Washington really works knew, in that moment, that this was not going to be another routine oversight exchange designed for cable news sound bites. This was not theater, not posturing, not a senator playing to his base or chasing a viral clip. This was a real question, the kind that corners its target into an impossible choice. Either lie under oath on live television or admit something that has been buried for years under layers of classification, talking points, and institutional denial. When Kash Patel went silent, completely silent, the room understood before the cameras did that something irreversible had just happened. That 10-second void, that absolute nothingness where an answer should have been, told us more than 1,000 prepared statements ever could. It told us about Crossfire Hurricane, about the FBI's targeting of Donald Trump, and about how deep the cover-up truly runs. If you are new here, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what you are about to hear will dominate the news cycle within hours. And you are hearing it first, unfiltered, and with the context that will conveniently disappear once the spin machine kicks in. Before we get to the moment itself, we need to set the scene carefully, because context is everything when power, law, and narrative collide. This was a Senate Judiciary Committee oversight hearing on FBI operations, a setting that usually produces procedural answers, evasive language, and very little in the way of genuine accountability. This time was different, and everyone in that room knew it before the questioning even began. The hearing room was packed, standing room only. An unusual sight for a Tuesday afternoon session that should have drawn little more than staffers and a handful of reporters. The reason was simple and widely understood among those who follow these things closely. Lindsey Graham had been signaling, quietly and deliberately, that he had something he had been building toward for months without telegraphing his intentions. He had been accumulating documents, cross-referencing testimony, mapping internal FBI communications against public statements, and waiting for the precise moment when all of it could no longer be brushed aside. That moment had arrived. Kash Patel entered the room with the confidence of someone who believed he had already survived everything Congress could throw at him. Shoulders back, tailored suit, controlled expression, the practiced demeanor of a man who had testified before Congress 17 times and thought he knew exactly how to manage another round. He was flanked by 3 lawyers, with 2 FBI liaisons seated directly behind him, and a thick briefing binder rested on the table, almost certainly filled with carefully drafted responses to every anticipated line of questioning. Those preparations would soon prove useless. The problem was not what Graham planned to ask, but how he planned to ask it. The first 45 minutes followed the familiar script, the kind of bureaucratic choreography Washington has perfected over decades. Other senators raised questions about budget allocations, staffing levels at field offices, counter-terrorism priorities, and internal compliance procedures. Patel handled them smoothly, delivering carefully worded non-answers, running out the clock on follow-ups, and giving just enough substance to sound responsive without revealing anything consequential. It was the performance of a man on autopilot, executing a routine he had mastered long ago. At that point, there was no reason for him to believe the day would be any different. Then Lindsey Graham took the microphone, and the energy in the room shifted instantly. It was the kind of shift that cannot be faked or explained away, the electric tension that comes when people realize they are about to witness something consequential. Graham did not raise his voice, did not signal aggression, did not announce his intentions. He did what experienced prosecutors do when they know the facts are on their side. He began calmly, almost conversationally. He did not start with Crossfire Hurricane, and that choice was deliberate. Graham is a prosecutor by training, a courtroom veteran from South Carolina who understands that you never lead with your strongest evidence. You build the foundation, establish the rules, and then force your witness to either honor those rules or expose themselves by violating them. Director Patel, Graham said evenly, I want to talk about standard FBI procedure for opening counterintelligence investigations. Can you walk me through the threshold requirements? It was safe territory, and Patel visibly relaxed. The FBI follows strict guidelines as outlined in the Attorney General's investigative protocols, Patel replied. We require predicate articulable facts that suggest a potential threat to national security before any investigation can be formally opened. Graham nodded as if satisfied and flipped a page in his notes. And those articulable facts need to be verified before you start surveilling American citizens, correct? Patel hesitated just long enough to choose his words. They need to be verified to the extent possible given the intelligence context. To the extent possible, Graham repeated slowly, locking the phrase into the record. He reached down and pulled out a document, holding it up so the cameras could capture it clearly. This is the opening authorization for Crossfire Hurricane, dated July 31, 2016, he said. Can you tell me what verified articulable facts justified opening a counterintelligence investigation into a presidential campaign? For the first time, Patel's expression tightened. Senator, I wasn't with the FBI in 2016, so I can't speak to the specific deliberations, Patel began. I am not asking about deliberations, Graham cut in sharply. I am asking about facts. What facts justified this investigation? The room went silent, not the polite quiet of a hearing waiting for a response, but the heavy stillness that signals something important is unfolding. Patel attempted to retreat behind familiar defenses. The Inspector General's report addressed many of these questions, he said, and found that while there were significant problems, the initial opening was within FBI guidelines. Within guidelines, Graham echoed, his tone neutral but precise. I've read that report 17 times. It says the opening met the low threshold for starting an investigation. It does not say the predicate was verified or that the facts were solid. There is a difference between technically permissible and actually justified. Wouldn't you agree? Patel shifted in his seat. Senator, I think that distinction is without a difference when it comes to national security threats. The answer landed poorly, and everyone could see it immediately. Wrong answer, Graham said flatly, opening a red folder and pulling out a stack of papers. Let me read you something. He held up another document. This is page 47 of the Crossfire Hurricane case file, declassified last month, he said. Opening predicate information received from a friendly foreign intelligence service regarding alleged contact between a Trump campaign advisor and Russian officials. He looked up slowly. That is it. That is the entire predicate. There was no verification of the foreign intelligence, no independent corroboration, no examination of source credibility, just raw, unverified information from a foreign government. And on that basis alone, the FBI opened an investigation into an American presidential campaign. Graham let that reality settle before continuing. Does that sound like verified, articulable facts to you, Director Patel? Patel's jaw tightened, his hands pressing flat against the table. Foreign intelligence is often the starting point for counterintelligence investigations, Patel said. We can't always verify information before acting when national security is at stake. But you didn't even try, Graham shot back. You didn't interview the source. You didn't examine the context. You just opened the investigation and started surveillance. And here is what really bothers me. He pulled out another document, and the room leaned forward collectively. This is an internal FBI memo dated August 15, 2016, 2 weeks after Crossfire Hurricane was opened. It's from the lead agent to the supervising special agent. Do you know what it says? No one moved, no one breathed. It says, we are unable to corroborate the initial predicate intelligence. All attempts to verify the alleged contact have produced negative results. Subject appears to have no direct ties to Russian intelligence services. He paused. Recommendation: close investigation due to lack of substantive evidence. Graham set the paper down slowly, deliberately. That memo was written 2 weeks after this investigation was opened, he continued. And instead of closing it, as your own agents recommended, the FBI escalated. You expanded the scope, added more targets, and sought FISA surveillance. He pointed directly at Patel. Why? Patel's face drained of color as the weight of the document settled over the room, and for the first time that afternoon, his practiced composure visibly cracked. This was no longer abstract debate about policy or procedure, no longer a matter of interpretation or hindsight. This was an internal FBI document, written by the agents closest to the case, recommending that Crossfire Hurricane be shut down because the central allegation could not be substantiated. The question Graham had asked was simple, direct, and devastating. Why was the investigation not closed when your own people said there was nothing there? Senator, I wasn't involved in those decisions, Patel said carefully, choosing each word as if it were a potential landmine. I can't speak to it, Graham repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. You've spent the last 3 years defending Crossfire Hurricane in public, Director Patel. You've called it a legitimate counterintelligence operation over and over again, and now, when confronted with your own agency's internal documents, you suddenly can't speak to it. There was no anger in Graham's tone now, only something colder and more dangerous, the controlled intensity of a prosecutor who knows the witness is cornered. This, Graham said, tapping the stack of papers in front of him, is the moment people need to pay attention to. He reached for one final document, sliding it out of a clear protective sleeve with deliberate care. Director Patel, do you recognize this signature? He held the page up so the cameras could capture it, and every lens in the room zoomed in. Patel stared at the document, and in real time his face cycled through recognition, calculation, and something that looked very much like fear. That is your signature, Graham pressed, isn't it? The hesitation was brief but unmistakable. Yes, Patel said quietly. That is my signature. The room collectively exhaled, sensing that the hearing had just crossed a point of no return. This memo is dated March of 2023, Graham continued, his voice steady, 7 years after Crossfire Hurricane began. It directs the FBI's Classification Review Board to maintain the highest possible classification on all Crossfire Hurricane documents pending ongoing review. He lowered the paper slowly. Ongoing review of what, Director? The investigation was long over. Everyone involved had either been fired, reassigned, or quietly resigned. There were no active leads, no open prosecutions, no national security threats tied to this case that could plausibly justify continued secrecy. And yet, Graham said, you personally directed that these documents remain classified. Why? What followed was 10 seconds of pure silence, the kind that feels longer than it actually is. I timed it. 10 full seconds of Kash Patel sitting frozen at the witness table, saying nothing, offering nothing, as his lawyers stared straight ahead and the FBI liaisons behind him avoided eye contact. There was no coughing, no shuffling of papers, no attempt to fill the void. Just silence. Finally, Graham leaned back in his chair, no longer pressing for an answer. Let me tell you what I think, Director, he said calmly. I think Crossfire Hurricane was the most disgusting episode in FBI history. Not because it was an intelligence failure, but because it was a deliberate, calculated use of America's premier law enforcement agency as a political weapon. He gathered his papers slowly, methodically. And I think everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing. Graham did not rush, did not raise his voice, and did not soften his words. I think the predicate was garbage from day one, he continued. I think when your own agents recommended closing the case, someone higher up made a political decision to keep it alive. I think the FISA warrants were based on opposition research the FBI knew was unverified. And I think you are still trying to bury the evidence because if the American people saw what is really in those files, they would understand just how corrupt this operation was. Patel opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Senator, Graham wasn't finished. Here is my question, Director, he said, leaning forward now. The question I need you to answer under oath, on camera, for the record. Did the FBI have any verified evidence, any actual proof that Donald Trump or his campaign had colluded with Russia when Crossfire Hurricane was opened? Yes or no? This time, the silence was even longer. 15 seconds, maybe 20. Patel looked to his lawyers, then to the FBI liaison seated behind him, then down at his hands resting on the table. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Senator, Patel finally said, that is a complex question that requires context about intelligence methodologies. It is a yes or no question, Graham interrupted. Did you have proof? Patel hesitated, visibly struggling to find a safe way out that no longer existed. He looked down again, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Nothing. The word hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Graham did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, allowing the implications of that single word to sink in. Your silence, he said at last, is answer enough. He stood, signaling that he was finished, and the gravity of the moment settled over the room. This committee will be issuing subpoenas for every Crossfire Hurricane document still under classification. We will demand testimony from every FBI official involved. And we will get to the bottom of why the FBI spent years investigating a president based on intelligence your own agents said was worthless. The hearing technically continued after that, but in any meaningful sense it was over. No one was paying attention to the remaining questions, the procedural back and forth, or the routine closing statements. The only thing anyone could think about was that silence. That eternal, damning silence when an FBI official could not say under oath that his agency had evidence to justify one of the most consequential investigations in modern American political history. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Social media erupted. Cable news cut into regular programming. Legal analysts began debating whether Patel's refusal to answer, followed by his admission of nothing, amounted to an implicit acknowledgement of a cover-up. For years, Americans had been told that Crossfire Hurricane was a proper counterintelligence investigation, that the FBI had good reasons to do what it did. On this day, under oath, an FBI official could not defend the predicate, could not explain the continued secrecy, and could not say there had been evidence. That silence was not neutral. Silence in this context was an admission. It was the sound of someone who knew the truth and knew that speaking it plainly would be devastating. Graham called Crossfire Hurricane the most disgusting episode in FBI history, and Patel could not disagree. He could not defend it. He could not even try. And that inability, more than any document or memo, revealed just how fragile the official narrative had become. Here is what happens next, and this part matters. Graham announced that subpoenas would be issued within 30 days. He is demanding a closed-door session with the Classification Review Board. He wants sworn testimony, not talking points, not press releases, not carefully crafted language designed to obscure rather than clarify. Washington has an extraordinary ability to bury scandals, but moments like this resist burial. This clip, this silence, this refusal to answer a yes or no question will not disappear. It will be replayed in campaign ads, dissected in courtrooms, and cited by historians trying to understand when public trust in institutions finally snapped. This is the kind of moment that defines narratives, that crystallizes years of suspicion into a single, undeniable image. Lindsey Graham asked the question that cut through all the spin. Kash Patel chose silence. 3 minutes. That is all it took to expose that the FBI either had no evidence when it began investigating Donald Trump, or is still hiding evidence so damaging it cannot allow anyone to see it. Either explanation is catastrophic for an institution that depends on public trust to function. The truth is coming out, one hearing at a time, one document at a time, and one damning silence at a time. The significance of what had just happened could not be overstated, even as the hearing room attempted to return to its procedural rhythm. Staffers shuffled papers, senators resumed their seats, and the formal machinery of congressional oversight rolled on as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everyone in that room understood the truth. The moment Lindsey Graham asked his final question, and Kash Patel could not answer it, the narrative that had protected Crossfire Hurricane for years collapsed under its own weight. What remained was not ambiguity, not nuance, but an absence so loud it overwhelmed everything else. In Washington, silence is rarely accidental. People speak for a living in that city, especially those who hold power, and when they do not speak, it is almost always because the cost of speaking is too high. Patel's silence was not confusion or forgetfulness. It was the calculated pause of someone weighing consequences and realizing that every available option led to the same outcome. To say yes would have been a lie under oath, and to say no would have confirmed what many had long suspected. For years, defenders of Crossfire Hurricane insisted that the investigation was justified, that the FBI had credible reasons to act, and that any mistakes were procedural rather than substantive. Those claims depended entirely on the assumption that somewhere, buried beneath classification stamps and redactions, there was real evidence. Not speculation, not rumor, not foreign hearsay, but proof. What Graham exposed was that when pressed, no one could point to it. The silence was the sound of that assumption collapsing. It is important to understand how unusual this was in the context of congressional hearings. Witnesses are trained extensively on how to deflect, reframe, and survive hostile questioning. They are taught to lean on phrases like ongoing investigation, classified material, and I would need to consult with counsel. Patel tried some of those moves earlier in the hearing, and they worked until they didn't. Graham stripped away every procedural escape route and reduced the issue to its core. Did the FBI have evidence when it opened Crossfire Hurricane? Not suspicion, not concern, not a hypothetical threat, but evidence. It was the kind of question that forces clarity, and clarity is dangerous when the truth is indefensible. Patel's eventual answer, a barely audible nothing, confirmed what the silence had already communicated. The investigation that consumed American politics for 3 years began without proof. That realization reframed everything that followed Crossfire Hurricane. The surveillance, the leaks, the media frenzy, the appointment of a special counsel, and the years of public distrust all flowed from an investigation that never had a verified factual foundation. The FBI did not simply fail to find evidence later. According to its own internal communications, it knew early on that the predicate could not be corroborated, and yet the investigation continued, expanded, and escalated. This is where the issue shifts from incompetence to intent. Mistakes happen in intelligence work, and good faith errors are an unavoidable part of national security operations. But when your own agents recommend closing a case due to lack of evidence and leadership chooses instead to press forward, something else is happening. That decision reflects priorities, values, and motivations that have nothing to do with neutral law enforcement. It suggests a political objective masquerading as a counterintelligence mission. Graham understood that distinction, and he made sure it was unmistakable. By walking Patel through FBI procedures before introducing the documents, he forced the agency to condemn itself by its own standards. Verified articulable facts were not an abstract concept in that room. They were the benchmark Patel himself had described moments earlier. When those standards were applied to Crossfire Hurricane, the case collapsed. The continued classification of documents 7 years later only deepened the suspicion. There was no ongoing investigation to protect, no active threat to national security that justified secrecy. The only plausible reason to maintain the highest level of classification was to prevent public scrutiny. Classification, in this context, was not a tool for safety, but a shield against accountability. Graham's exposure of Patel's role in that decision was surgical and devastating. It revealed not just a past failure, but an ongoing effort to control the narrative. By keeping documents hidden, the FBI could continue to frame Crossfire Hurricane as a complicated but well-intentioned operation. Releasing those documents risked exposing the truth, that the investigation lacked evidence from the start and continued despite internal warnings. That truth would not merely embarrass individuals, it would undermine institutional credibility on a massive scale. The reaction outside the hearing room was immediate and predictable. Supporters of the FBI rushed to minimize the moment, arguing that intelligence work cannot be reduced to yes or no answers. Critics pointed out that Graham's question was not about methodology, but about facts. Did evidence exist or not? Patel's inability to answer spoke louder than any legal brief or press statement. Media coverage reflected the same divide. Some outlets framed the exchange as political theater, while others focused on the unprecedented nature of the silence. Legal analysts debated whether Patel's response constituted an admission under oath. Former prosecutors noted that in any courtroom in America, silence in response to such a question would be interpreted as confirmation of the negative. The debate itself underscored how destabilizing the moment had been. What could not be debated was the impact on public trust. Institutions like the FBI rely on credibility to function effectively. They ask for extraordinary powers, surveillance authority, and secrecy based on the promise that those powers will be exercised responsibly. When that promise is broken, or appears to be broken, the damage is profound. Graham's questioning struck at the heart of that trust. This was not about partisan loyalty or political preference. It was about whether the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country could justify its actions with facts. Patel's silence suggested that it could not. For many Americans, that realization confirmed long-held suspicions that the rules were applied unevenly. For others, it was a moment of disillusionment that forced a reassessment of institutional narratives they had accepted without question. Graham's decision to announce subpoenas immediately was no coincidence. He understood that momentum matters and that allowing the moment to dissipate would benefit those who preferred obscurity. Subpoenas shift the burden from voluntary cooperation to compelled disclosure. They signal seriousness and intent, and they raise the stakes for everyone involved. The message was clear. This was not over. The demand for a closed-door session with the Classification Review Board was equally strategic. If classification decisions were being used to hide misconduct rather than protect security, that board would have to explain itself under oath. Those explanations would be difficult to reconcile with Patel's silence. Every layer of review increased the risk that contradictions would emerge, and contradictions are dangerous in sworn testimony. As the hearing concluded, one image dominated coverage. Not Graham's documents, not Patel's lawyers, not even the dramatic language used in the exchange. It was the image of an FBI official sitting in silence, unable to answer a fundamental question about evidence. That image would be replayed countless times, stripped of context by some and scrutinized deeply by others. Either way, it could not be erased. History often turns on moments that seem small at the time. A pause, a hesitation, a refusal to answer can carry more weight than hours of testimony. This was one of those moments. It crystallized years of controversy into a single, undeniable fact. When asked directly, the FBI could not say it had proof. For Lindsey Graham, the objective had been achieved. He did not need Patel to confess or explain. The silence did the work for him. It exposed the fragility of the official story and shifted the burden of explanation back where it belonged. From that point forward, it would be the FBI explaining itself to the public, not critics defending their skepticism. The implications extended beyond Crossfire Hurricane. If this investigation could proceed without evidence, what did that say about oversight, safeguards, and accountability? What other decisions had been made under similar assumptions? The questions raised by Graham's exchange would not be easily answered, and they would not disappear. They would linger, shaping debates and perceptions for years to come. As the cameras shut off and the room slowly emptied, the gravity of the moment settled in. This was not just another contentious hearing. It was a turning point in how Americans understood one of the most consequential investigations in modern history. The silence at the center of it all would echo far beyond that room, and it ensured that the story of Crossfire Hurricane was far from finished. The final phase of the hearing unfolded under the weight of what had already been said, and more importantly, what had not been said. No procedural maneuver, no carefully phrased follow-up question, and no institutional defense could undo the moment when Kash Patel failed to articulate a justification for Crossfire Hurricane. That absence now hung over the room like a verdict that had already been reached. Everyone present understood that the remaining testimony was irrelevant to the broader story that had just been written in real time. The record had been made, and it would not be erased. In Washington, narratives harden quickly once a defining moment occurs. Staffers immediately began clipping the exchange, isolating the question, isolating the silence, isolating the single word that followed it. The clip did not need editing or embellishment. It did not need dramatic music or commentary. It stood on its own, because silence, when it comes from power, is self-explanatory. For years, the defense of Crossfire Hurricane had relied on complexity. The argument was always that the matter was too nuanced, too classified, too deeply embedded in intelligence methodology for the public to fully understand. That defense collapsed when Graham reframed the issue into a binary question that cut through every layer of obfuscation. Did you have evidence, or did you not? When the answer did not come, complexity gave way to clarity. The refusal to answer did more than undermine the justification for one investigation. It cast doubt on the credibility of the entire institutional response that followed it. Every press conference, every leak, every public assurance that the FBI had acted appropriately now had to be re-evaluated through the lens of that silence. If there was no verified evidence at the beginning, then everything that followed was built on sand. That realization fundamentally altered the moral and legal landscape of the debate. What made the moment so powerful was not Graham's rhetoric, but his restraint. He did not accuse Patel of criminal conduct. He did not demand resignations on the spot. He allowed the facts and the absence of facts to speak for themselves. In doing so, he forced the audience to draw its own conclusions, which is far more effective than telling people what to think. The silence also revealed something deeper about institutional behavior. Organizations protect themselves instinctively, especially when the stakes are existential. Admitting that Crossfire Hurricane lacked evidence would not merely tarnish reputations. It would call into question decision-making processes, oversight mechanisms, and the integrity of leadership across multiple administrations. Silence, in that context, becomes a survival mechanism. But survival through silence carries its own cost. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore, particularly when the breach involves secrecy and power. Many Americans had already grown skeptical of official explanations surrounding the Trump investigation. This moment did not create that skepticism. It validated it. The aftermath unfolded exactly as one would expect in a city driven by perception and momentum. Defenders of the FBI scrambled to contextualize Patel's response, arguing that intelligence assessments cannot be reduced to courtroom standards of proof. Critics responded that the FBI itself had invoked those standards when justifying surveillance and investigative authority. The debate was no longer theoretical. It was anchored to a specific question and a specific non-answer. Graham's announcement of subpoenas ensured that the issue would not fade quietly into the background. Subpoenas forced choices. They compel disclosure or resistance, and both options carry consequences. If documents are released, they risk confirming what Patel could not deny. If they are withheld, the act of withholding becomes part of the story itself. The demand for testimony from classification officials added another layer of pressure. Classification decisions are rarely scrutinized publicly, and for good reason when national security is genuinely at stake. But when classification appears to function as a tool for embarrassment avoidance rather than protection, scrutiny becomes unavoidable. Graham's strategy targeted that vulnerability directly. It challenged the assumption that secrecy itself is a sufficient explanation. What followed in the days after the hearing was not a single revelation but a steady accumulation of doubt. Every defense of Crossfire Hurricane now had to contend with the fact that, under oath, the FBI could not assert it had evidence at the outset. That fact became the reference point for every subsequent discussion. It shifted the burden of proof entirely. Those defending the investigation now had to explain why silence was acceptable. This moment will endure because it crystallizes a broader institutional crisis. The power to investigate, surveil, and prosecute carries with it an obligation to act on verified facts. When that obligation is compromised, intentionally or otherwise, the legitimacy of the entire system comes into question. Graham's question exposed that vulnerability with surgical precision. Patel's silence confirmed it. Years from now, historians examining this period will not need to parse thousands of pages of classified material to identify the turning point. They will point to this exchange, to this question, and to the pause that followed. They will note how an investigation that shaped elections, presidencies, and public trust could not be defended in the simplest terms when challenged directly. They will recognize that this was the moment the narrative changed, not because of what was revealed, but because of what could no longer be denied. The truth rarely arrives all at once in Washington. It emerges incrementally through hearings, documents, and moments of unintended honesty. Sometimes it emerges through silence. That silence, captured on camera and preserved in the public record, now stands as a testament to the fragility of institutional narratives when confronted with fundamental questions. And it ensures that Crossfire Hurricane will never again be discussed without acknowledging what happened in that hearing room. This is why the moment matters. Not because it settles every argument or answers every question, but because it strips away the illusion that the answers exist somewhere out of reach. When asked directly under oath, the FBI could not say it had proof. Everything else flows from that fact, and no amount of spin, classification, or delay can put that silence back into the bottle.